bird encounters, bird sightings, anything fun in nature that's happened since the last time we saw you, whether that was last month or before. So I'll open it up. Anybody got a story to share?
Emily and I found a pair of copperhead snakes at Altama WMA this past weekend, and we're like on the very southern end of their range. It was one of a few snake species I hadn't found in Vinton yet.
Wow. Yeah, I've never seen one around here. That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah, venomous.
They are.
Well, I was out walking on the Cox Road, is that the Alabama Wildlife area? Is that the northern section off of Cox Road, west of Darien, the other day in the woods, and there were several limpkins.
Oh,
And that was really quite something. I really could only see one of them fly in, the other ones were hidden back in the, but the sound they made was, unmistakable.
Yeah.
So that was very cool.
Wow, I've never seen one. It's on my bucket list. Yeah.
Gainesville.
Mel.
I saw a red-headed woodpecker in my house in Glenn County, off of Buck Swamp Road. I've never seen one there before. I think it was a young one. Like
Yeah.
A yearling.
Cool, that's one of my favorite birds.
Yeah, definitely.
They're smaller than, like, when the first time I saw one, I was like, I thought they were bigger than this.
There has been a little colony of them at college here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think there's been a report or two just recently, but I haven't
Mhm.
seen it.
Both the bird walks we've done here with students, we've seen them in the pines around the perimeter of the campus.
I have one thing.
Yeah.
I went on the bird walk with Bob leading back on Saturday. We lost 2 birds in the bottom.
We found them this morning, they're still there.
Any other good stories from that trip?
We did hear a king rail.
Ooh,
Yeah.
cool.
Didn't see it.
It's always, this is the main place I bird, so it's always fun to add a couple to my life list. So
Uh-huh.
on Saturday, I added 2 to my life list, a Wilson snipe and a sword.
All right, great. I got to add one. Folks that know me know I'm not that much of a lister, but you can't not get excited about seeing a bird you've never seen before. And so I got to see a western tanager when we did the great backyard bird count on Jackal. Dan, you got one?
Yeah, not necessarily uncommon, but I gotta promote this, our new wetland that we just built on Jekyll. We just got a bunch of, it's a very rudimentary wetland right now with not much around it. Got wood ducks starting to come in and use that site and use the wood duck box we put there, so we didn't think that was gonna happen yet, so they're coming. You build it, they'll come.
You did it. You did it right, I guess. That's
It's
so
in
fast.
Oleander Golf Course, the old Oleander Golf Course. It's not open yet, but we're working on restoring right now, so yeah. Thanks to anybody who came out and helped with the planting, if you did.
For anybody that came to the Christmas party, we walked out and looked at that before the Christmas party this year.
There was a nesting pair in the wood duck house on Horton Pond. I saw them in there a couple of weeks ago, and today when I was there this morning, there was a rat snake. Looked like he was having breakfast, hanging in the hole.
Yeah. I'll mention one other. I just always enjoy seeing the Wilson's plovers when they show back up. So I live on Jackal and fortunate to be able to take my dogs for a walk out there, and so it's a nice sign of spring that they're showing up and pairing up and kind of establishing their own territories. Great. All right, good stuff. Well, we can move on, and I have a few announcements. One is that we have a new board member. So Melissa Quinn, who some of y'all know, is our newest board member for Coastal Georgia Audubon. And Mel came to Golden Isles way back around the same time I first started working on Jekyll, 2010? Yeah, to work at the 4-H Center. She's been a special education teacher for 11 years and also leads kayak tours at Tidelands Nature Center on Jekyll. And her spark bird is the Carolina Wren, which I think is cool to be excited about really common things and appreciative of how awesome they are, even though they're common. And Mel is one of the top 30 e-birders for Glenn County in the past year. So she is a serious So welcome Mel to the board, and a reminder for everyone else to, if you're not already on our board, to let us know if you might be interested, because we do need that fresh energy and ideas, and folks roll off as they move on to other things and whatnot. So think about it and let us know. Also, we've got a slate of field trips coming up. So this weekend, this Saturday in Folkestone, to go check out the Okefenokee. Bob, you want to say anything about that trip coming up?
We do this every year about this time, try to hit the east side of the Okefenokee. And Kurt Hofer, who's usually on our trips, is not here tonight, but he'll be leading this one. I'll just be hanging in the background.
All right.
But we meet at the visitor center at 8 o'clock, I think, and our target birds are red cockaded woodpeckers and bottom sparrows, big sandhill cranes that are making noise.
Yeah. Do Limpkins show up around there or no? All right. And then as we get into April, 2 Wednesdays, April 15th and April 22nd, so Earth Day. The first one will be a warbler walk on St. Simon's at Cannons Point, and then on Earth Day, a warbler walk at Tupelo Trail, Horton Pond on Jekyll. So I'm looking forward to helping lead that one.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Warbler walks coming up April 15th on St. Simon's at Cannons Point, and April 22nd on Jekyll at Horton Pond.
Those are times to be pretty close to the peak of spring migration, so interesting visitors coming through.
And I don't think we've opened registration yet for the Altamaha Delta boat trip. Am I right on that? Okay. So that's, keep an eye out for that. That's a members only trip, but that's coming down the pipe too. So, any other announcements? All right, well, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. I'm excited that Robert Horan agreed to give us a presentation. So Robert is an old friend and colleague of mine. He's a senior wildlife biologist with the Wildlife Resources Division of Georgia DNR. Specialty is wildlife habitat management. And Robert's alum of University of Georgia for bachelor's and master's degrees, so a double dog, as we call it. And we were part of the same cohort at the Mornell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. I was studying fish at the time. And y'all probably have some people in your life who like said something at some point that probably was, for them, was like an offhand comment, but it kind of stuck with you. Does that resonate with anybody? Yeah? So I've got one of those for Robert, and he doesn't know this. He did. So we were at like a happy hour, or maybe it was a house party or something, you know, and a group of grad students sitting around shooting the breeze. And I can't remember what the conversation was that led up to this. But what Robert said was, you know, we need to accept that we're the experts. And that it stuck with me, and I think the reason it stuck with me is like that kind of confidence becomes really important as you move from sort of your educational career into your professional career. And so as we left University of Georgia, and you know, Robert found his way to Georgia DNR, I found my way to starting up the conservation program on Jekyll. You know, I kind of needed that confidence in the back of my mind, so I was glad that comment kind of stuck with me. But so Robert's work focuses on the game species for Georgia DNR as part of the game management side of the Wildlife Resources Division. So things like American alligators, white-tailed deer, turkey, quail. But a lot of those game management decisions have really important ramifications for non-game species that we want to conserve, like eastern indigo stake, swallow-tailed kite, gopher tortoise, etc. And one of the reasons I was really excited for Robert to speak to this group is he's had responsibilities for managing the Altamaha WMA and all of the halmets up there, which you all know are exceptional waterfowl habitat in the wintertime. So I'm excited to hear about that. Robert lives in Nahunta, and with his wife Mary Lou, who's also a wildlife biologist, and his two children, Eason
Easton and Naomi.
and Naomi. And you grew up around there, right? Yeah, so born and raised, native son here, and you're the expert, Robert, so why don't you tell us
That
about
was probably after about 5 cups of mulled wine. It's funny you said that because my boss reiterated that to me about 5 years later. I was starting a big fire in Richmond Hill, and fire is one of those things where people either love it or they're really upset with us. And I had to do a news interview, and I was like, "No, man, this is you. You do the news interview." He's like, "You're the expert. You just burned 1,000 acres this year. Go do it." So there's sometimes where you're definitely not the expert, but you gotta fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
So thanks you all for coming out tonight. I want to sit down so I can click through this, but I may get a walk around a little bit. I didn't interrupt into everybody else's field notes, but my cool one from last week is I saw 4 sandhill cranes migrating back north. I was outside of Vidalia at my in-laws' place. We were just hanging out by the pond, and here come 4 sandhills. You could hear them from long before you could see them. There were some geese in the water, and sandhills started swirling around. They never landed. They called for probably 10 minutes and decided they don't want to land and kept on going. So I was really excited to see those. Have no idea where they came from. I guess there's a pond somewhere by that's been hosting them. So Ben and I started in the whole natural resources program about the same time. I was actually focusing on tree frogs in Panama, looking at migratory habits and complementary habitat use. Ben was staying in South Carolina, looking at the impoundment ponds and at the moors and other areas around that. And right after grad school, we were all competing for the same jobs, all of us. We all applied for Jekyll, a bunch of us applied for DNR jobs, and it was kind of cool going through, seeing how the cohort of fellow grad students, where everybody ends up, what you're doing. Currently, as you've heard, I'm with the Wildlife Resource Division of the Department of Natural Resources. I'm not a game warden. Everybody thinks we are. I think we have 2,500 employees within the Wildlife Resources Division, and there might be about 200 game wardens that are within the state. They're actually in their own division now. Within the Wildlife Resources Division, our motto or our creed now is to conserve and promote fishing, hunting, and wildlife resources through management, education, and scientific research. And as Ben mentioned, within my group, the game management section, we focus on the game species, and everything has to do with where the money comes from. Our number one funding source is through the Pittman-Robertson Act and the Sport, Fish, and Game Restoration Act. It was passed by Congress back in the 60s. Anytime somebody buys a gun, a bullet, a piece of camouflage, a duck boat, a duck decoy, anything hunting related, there's an excise tax taken off for those items. So from 11 to 13%, depending on what the item is. That money is then given to the Fish and Wildlife Service to distribute to the 50 states and territories, and also some reservations. So while I say we're the game management section, that's what our money says we do, that's what our paperwork says we do. In practice, everybody in Wildlife Resources divisions we're no longer individual species managers. We're at the point now everybody's ecosystem managers. So here we're focused on the longleaf savanna system, the coastal marsh system. These modified impoundments are kind of an alteration of a freshwater wetland system. So we're no longer focusing on single species. Now it's looking at the ecosystem and all the species that are in that group. Sorry about that. The wildlife management has traveled over a little bit. But within wildlife resources, I think we're now, number us up to 106 wildlife management areas around the state. The goal a few years ago was to have a wildlife management area within 1 hour of every citizen in the state of Georgia. That goal has been reached and surpassed. And every one of these dots on the map has its own specific management plan and its own specific kind of design in the landscape, what it's gonna provide, why it exists. They're not there solely for recreation. A lot of people think the wildlife management areas exist just a deer hunt on them. That's, could be farther from the truth. But of all the properties we have, every one has its own focal group or its own focal management plan. That recreation aspect is definitely a large one. That gives the public an ownership, a vested interest in the property. But there's always something much deeper and much more objective oriented about that property. For tonight, I'm gonna focus in, as has been talked about, a little closer to home, right here at Altamont. Our region within our work group, it kind of makes an L. We have the entire Georgia coast, so we have some property up near Richmond Hill. We have a little Tybee natural area. We have Altamont Island. So we have the entire coastal area all the way down to our newest property, Ceylon, WMA, and Camden County. And then we go west all the way to Grand Bay near Valdosta. The area I focus most of my time though is in the lower Altamont River corridor. And Brunswick is just southwest of the corner of the map. But the Altamont River corridor it's a very special place to me. It's one that I became familiar with when I was still in high school, before I knew anything about DNR or anything about Wildlife Resources Division. I spent a lot of time camping, a lot of time hunting, a lot of time canoeing on there. Really love that lower section of the river, from pretty much from Williamsburg down to the coast. Currently, there are about 140,000 acres conserved in that corridor. About 125,000 of those are DNR property. Included in that area is Little St. Simons with the conservation easement. The Nature Conservancy managed on that a few years ago. There's a few fish and wildlife reserves, or fish and wildlife conservation properties. Wolf Island is the largest in our area. If you go a little bit further, you start getting into Wausau and those other areas. But right here, the feds aren't as represented as much as they are further up the coast. Townsend Bombing Range. Has anyone been to Townsend Bombing Range? A lot of people hear that whole term, the Townsend Bombing Range. You think, oh my gosh, it's gotta be a horrible thing. The Townsend Bombing Range was probably one of the most recent conservation successes to impact this area. The U.S. Marine Corps out of Beaufort operates that bombing range. It's expanded quite a bit in the last few years. This map shows it at 11,000 acres. I think it's closer to 15,000 acres now. It's a pretty low impact property. For the most part, it's a big loblolly plantation. They do a lot of fire, a lot of burning. There's some historic records of flatwood salamanders on it, so they do some management for flatwoods ponds. But what it provided for the Altamont corridor was a flight training area for all these aircraft coming in off of aircraft carriers, out of Hunter Army Airfield, out of Mayport, out of NAS Jax. And they come into this area just like they do at Grand Bay Range in Valdosta. And they have an impact area on towns, I think it's maybe 500 acres of impact area. They're shooting plastic bullets into targets, and they're dropping concrete bombs into these little bunkers and makeshift communities and towns and all this other stuff. The area around that is extremely protected, as you can imagine any military installation would be. But the other part of that comes with having a portion of national security training there, is the desire for the military to keep neighborhoods and development outside of those training areas. So a number of years ago, the military got on board with all the state natural resources agencies and created a whole unit called ACUB. It's pretty much compatible use buffer zone around the military reserves. So a lot of the funding that we've been provided in the last decade has come from the Marine Corps, from the Navy, and from other branches of the military to acquire property around these training areas. The same thing down there, St. Mary's here, the sub base down there. To pretty much keep these in permanent conservation and perpetuity. It keeps houses from being developed around them. It keeps towns and communities from being developed around them. They want these areas in as natural of a landscape as possible. They want the fuel reduction to be completed in these areas so there's not catastrophic wildfires that would later impact their training and operations. So a lot of the more recent purchases along the Altamont corridor have been a complement to the bombing range on the north side of the river. Now I say that, the bombing range actually came in following the original acquisitions by DNR. The department, started acquiring property back in the 50s and 60s. Some of the first acquisitions were in the Lower Altamaha. Lewis's Island was one of the early ones. Wolf Island was a very early one. The Egg Island Bar was a very early acquisition. Just prior to I-95 coming through the coast, the Altamaha properties were purchased up and impoundments were starting to be managed there. So this corridor hasn't been created overnight. It's been taking place over about 50 or 60 years, but currently that's where we stand. There's a couple of recent additions in the Morgan Lake area. That's pretty much what we're working with on this area now. And again, this is where the majority of my work takes place. I love it. It's got an amazing variety of habitats, and Altamaha WMA is only a small postage stamp within this corridor that I work in. So the Altamaha Wildlife Management Area and the waterfowl area, it straddles the Altamaha River, and it straddles this gradient of salinity. The most western portion of Altamaha is up near Altamaha Park. Is anybody familiar with that area? Off of 341. We have most of the property on the north side of the river. If you're standing at Altamaha Park, everything in every direction from that area is DNR property. But this is all fresh water. This is Altamaha Park right here. At this point, the river has a slight tide to it, but it's pretty much a one-directional flow. When the tide comes up, the river just slows down, backs up. Instead of flowing out, the water kind of stands still and gets higher. When the next tide goes out on the coast, it continues flushing. So all that fresh water is still leaving this area. Once you get right in here past Alligator Congress and you start getting into Stud Horse and Lewis's Creek, you start getting a slight gradient of salinity coming up, and the river branches off in 100 directions. And I'm not exaggerating when I say 100 directions. There's sloughs, there's creeks, there's oxbows, there's drains, there's former canals. The Brunswick-Altama Canal hits the river right down there. But the river just goes every direction. So while the river may go into flood stage here and jump 10 or 12 feet sometimes, down here, if the river goes in flood stage, it might only jump up 3 or 4 feet above that high tide. But this tract right here, the Lewis Island tract, this was one of the original acquisitions of really DNR in the state of Georgia. There were a few properties prior to this, but this is one of the very initial purchases. And this is one of the largest intact, partially intact, native bald cypress forests that exists in the state of Georgia. There's some trees, I'll show you one of them a little bit later, but there's some trees in here that they're truly prehistoric trees. Some of them are 2,000, 2,500 years old. Most of the trees that are out there were culled and left by the timber industry to clear cut most of that area in the 30s, 40s, or prior to that. But there's some amazing tracts of forest out there. If you haven't been out to the Lewis tract, arrange a field trip, do what you gotta do, get out there, you're gonna get muddy, but you're definitely gonna be impressed. The majority of our operations on the Altamaha River start taking place when we hit this fork of the South Altamaha, the Chantney, the Butler River, where it really starts breaking up and braiding towards the coast. So the majority of our waterfowl and other management work takes place right in this area. So I-95 cuts through the middle of the property. US 9917 cuts through the eastern edge of the property. As you continue going further east, you get into more of that saline environment. When you get out to the eastern edge of the property, you're at the Intercoastal Waterway, you're at a regular full salinity oceanfront right there. When the tide comes in, the fresh water stops and full tidal water comes into it. During the heat of the summer, if there's no rainfall or very low rainfall, low river output, you'll get 35, 40 parts per thousand of salt out there. And there's oysters growing all the way up into some of these areas, depending on which side of the freshwater you're at. So it's a very diverse environment, it's a very diverse habitat. And as you can imagine from a bird perspective, you get every clade of species coming through on the coast, from saltwater all the way to freshwater floodplain forest. The property's been there as long as property has existed. It's got a long history. The Altamaha and the property around it has been occupied for at least 5,000 years. There's early archaic settlements on it. There's woodland and Mississippian time period settlements on it. Since those time periods, we've had a pretty significant amount of sea level rise, so a lot of those old village sites and other sites, a lot of those are underwater at this point. A lot of the most significant archaeological sites from this time frame are actually below the river level currently, so they've been found during dredging or during excavation activities. There are some surface remnants and some other things, but those are on higher points near oyster middens or some other stuff on the lower parts of the river. Butler Island, where I focus most of my time, it's been a powerful and an important economic engine since about 1750. When the first agriculture was taking place on Butler Island, the Altamaha River was the boundary for the Georgia colony. It was the boundary of what was then a British colony. The United States had no concept of existence at that time. Everything south and west of the Altamaha was considered Indian land. When you went down on the coast, the settlements, the white settlements, the English settlements went a little bit further. They went down into Jekyll Island even. But Darien was, prior to it being Darien, it was a fort town, a settlement back into the even earlier 1700s. But the first documented agriculture taking place in this area was in about 1750. That timeline, if anybody's familiar with their older history, falls when the Georgia colony kind of went against the English settlement rules of no slavery in the Georgia colonies. So when slavery was allowed, all those planters, they brought in slaves. They brought them in from the Carolinas for the most part, or from Virginia's. Later on, slaves were brought in on the boat. They were brought in from West African countries and brought in for the development and settlement of this coastal area. The area that a lot of people talk about, Butler Island, was first named such in about 1790. Major Pierce Butler, who was one of the U.S. founding fathers of the United States, was a South Carolina planter. He was actually a Scots-Englishman. His wife died in 1790. He left where he was at in Carolina, brought his money, came down to the Darien area, and developed 3 plantations. He developed Butler Island Plantation, which he named for his family. He developed Hampton on St. Simon's, and developed Woodville, which was further in, where it was more of a cotton plantation. Cannons Point and Hampton and all that area, Cannons Point was a little bit later, but most of those were Sea Island cotton plantations. The Butler Island plantation, while it went through a lot of different crops and rotations and things, it was mostly a rice plantation. Major Pierce Butler died on the property. He had no sons to speak of. He had 2 different daughters, and one of his daughters had a son who was Pierce Mees. When that son became majority heir, he changed his name as part of the tradition, part of the obligation to that family. He changed his surname to Butler. At that time, he became partial owner, 50%, with one of his brothers. And they, between these 2 different Butlers, which are grandfather and grandson, and then the daughter later on, Butler Island was operated continuously till about 1923. Very different states of conditions on the property. There are some very significant historical time frames that occurred and took place on this. If you go back in U.S. history, there's some extremely significant kind of bullet points that occurred. Pierce Mees Butler, he married Fanny Kimball, who was an English lady that she was in plays, and she was kind of a modern day soap opera actress, super popular at the time worldwide. They came to the Butler Island plantation. Fanny Kimball was not a fan whatsoever of the slavery system at all. She wrote a book of her time here, and that book was circulated widely in England and the Northeast. And that book was said to be one of the initial sparks that got into the mass media and got into the public sentiment about anti-slavery within the Georgia colonies, within the United States, and all the stuff that had taken place then. And it lit quite a fire in the other communities. So in 1850, when Butler was kind of at its peak and heyday, there were 117 similar plantations in McIntosh County alone. Butler Island was the largest. It was the largest contributor. It was the largest producer in the area. In 1857, 1858, there was a pretty significant economic crash, and Pierce Butler, due to his leverage of his stuff and the lifestyles that he lived, he was called out by his debtors, and he sold half of his stock on the plantation, which at that time were his enslaved farmers. So that single event was the largest sale of enslaved farmers in the United States history. They call it the Weeping Times. Nearly 500 individuals were taken to Savannah, sold in an auction block. That was May 2nd, 3rd, 1859. Even a year after that, his property still, according to the tax system and the census, still had 505 enslaved farmers, and they produced over a million pounds of rice that year. So that's after they were at peak. Shortly after that, things came to a screeching halt. The Butlers left. They went back to Philadelphia, where they spent most of their time. Dairy was raised and burned. All buildings on Butler Island, except for a couple, were burned down, and all those enslaved farmers were set free. So you can imagine, things changed quite a bit. This is a print that's been circulated for quite some time. It's from Harper's Weekly. This is kind of a generic, if you will, view of how the rice plantations worked and how the economic system worked. A lot of the planters, they're heavy into writing and heavy into agricultural documentation. So there's lots of notes, lots of documentation on exactly how farms and everything were run. But pretty much the entire system was dried out using Dutch engineering and enslaved labor. River berms were built on the edges of the rivers. All these stands of virgin cypress were cut down and dropped into the field. Some were floated out and used if they were capable of being used, but most of them were too big. So they were just dropped down in place in the field and farmed around them. Field beds were cultivated throughout the entire winter. Rice was started in the early spring. There was a tradition called chasing the rice. So you had your watermen at the time. They would navigate the inflow of the water coming through the rice trunks. As the rice grew taller and flowered and started to put head on, they raised the elevation of the water following that up. So they chased the rice all spring long. Once the rice matured, the fields were dried down. The rice was manually cut, manually piled, put into areas that they could then reflood the fields, reflood the canals, put the rice on these flat boats and pirogues, and float that product with bush pole out to the main nucleus of plantations. Butler Island had its own rice mill. There's actually 4 different rice mills on the property. If you could sell a refined product, the market was that much higher rather than selling a raw, unrefined product. So they say that the Butlers, they ran very militant properties. They ran very strict properties. They ran very efficient properties where they built nearly everything they could. They produced all their own goods that they could. Woodville produced most of the livestock and the food that was then used for the enslaved out here on the coastal plantations. But all this came to a screeching halt about 1863. Started prior to that, and things changed after that. So one of the daughters of Pierce Butler was Fran Butler. He had 2 daughters with 2 very opposing views on the agricultural system and the economic system of the United States. Frances Butler Lee, she was the daughter that she was not fully opposed to the slavery system, but she also saw all the negatives in it. But she came back and she tried to farm that property. She used freedmen with the contracts with the Freedmen's Bureau. She used most of the farmers that were still on the property. A lot of folks never left, and that's all they had known for their entire life and their generations ahead of them. So most of the folks that were on that property, even after the Civil War, they remained on those properties. So she put in a good time trying to farm it using sharecropping. It just didn't work out. There's a reason we don't grow rice on the Georgia coast today. It's not an economically viable situation. It's a very, very rough environment. It's not like the fields out in Arkansas and Louisiana, Mississippi, where you're farming on essentially dry land. Everything out here is just a dry cap of mud with saturated mud below it, so it's a very difficult environment to work with. So Frances Lee Butler, she married one of the priests in Darien. They left, went to England. They didn't go back, but they left and went to England. Never came back here after about 1890. One of her children stayed on the property until 1923, and then Colonel Hudson, who was a part owner in the Yankees, came down, and as was accustomed during that time, all these rich Northerners were coming down and making winter retreats on the Georgia coast, the South Carolina coast, the Florida coast. The same over in the Bainbridge area. So a lot of these rich Northerners came down, they bought properties, they bought what were former plantations for pennies on the dollar, and they turned them into recreational properties. From 1924 to 38, Colonel Hudson was on the property. He lived there. He died in the house that he built. If anybody had been to Darien prior to 2 years ago, you drove by the house, you saw the house. Everybody and the brothers assumed it was a plantation house. It was 100% a recreational home built by a rich Northerner in 1927, I believe, when it was completed. They hosted summer training camps for some baseball players. They shot ducks. They grew produce. It was a recreational property in every aspect for that dozen or so years he was around there. Right after his death, the R.J. Reynolds family came in and bought the property up. They held on to it for just a little bit, and then they flipped it over to the state, which the Reynolds family did with quite a few properties in coastal Georgia. So I'm going to go through some of our objectives for this property particularly, but as I said, this property has been occupied for about 5,000 years. Anything above the tide line and a lot of below the tide line area has been occupied and used and utilized repeatedly for generations. If there's something above the water line, someone has lived there, toiled there, and probably died there. All of these red circles or the polygons within them are well-documented historical sites. We preserve these areas. We don't work through them. We don't work on top of them. We work around them for the most part as best we can. If we do have to go through an area, we have special precautions, give it a buffer, preserve these areas. Most of them are all below ground features at this point, but it's pretty well mapped out on the property. So, as I said a little while ago, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the state of Georgia was making some pretty significant purchases up and down the Georgia coast. The state of Georgia and the Nature Conservancy were the kind of entities that work together. There was a thing created as the Natural Heritage Trust was created back at that time. And these properties that had well-known historical and ecological features to them, those were purchased as the first acquisitions. So that's what first bought that property, brought the state of Georgia into acquisition, and Lewis's Island and the Egg Island Bar and Wolf Island were all part of that early purchase. So, as I said earlier, all these properties have very specific goals and objectives. The number one objective we have on Altamaha is to provide a wintering area for waterfowl. That goes back to when the U.S. was kind of recovering and managing their waterfowl species back in the 60s and 70s, and some enlightened souls said, hey, if you don't have somewhere for these birds to sleep during the winter, they're not coming back north and they're not going to make it. So refuges were developed all up and down the East Coast and down throughout the Gulf, and wintering waterfowl and the habitat required for that was one of the primary goals set then and continues to be our primary goal currently. Nesting and brood habitat is another major goal we have, but as y'all are aware, most of our waterfowl diversity is here during the winter. Once it gets hot, they keep going, they head north, they go to the major breeding grounds. The main species we provide habitat to historically were wood ducks, and then after some biologists decided to play with them, we got mottled ducks on the Georgia coast. I don't know what time frame that occurred. You know when mottled ducks were first introduced? I'm guessing it was in the 70s or 80s, I really don't know. But mottled ducks have been a resident breeder here for at least 50, 60 years, so we've provided a lot of habitat for mottled ducks. And in the last probably 2 decades, black-bellied whistling ducks have made a natural range expansion from a lot of areas in central and southern Mexico and lower Gulf areas They followed the Atlantic around, followed the Gulf around, and now we have an extremely established flock of black-bellied whistling ducks that breed every year on Butler. And as y'all know from eBird, they're spreading around to most of the state, or most of the counties in the state at this point. So we've had an established colony there for quite a while. It seems to grow every year. We usually host 350 to 400 birds pre-nesting. Some of those birds hang around for a little bit, mingle and move. We have pretty clear exchange of birds between us and all the impoundments at Savannah Refuge and going into South Carolina all the way up to Yawkey up in Georgetown. So those birds do move around quite a bit. Typically, by early September, most of those brood have became flighted, and a lot of those birds head south down to Florida or points further south. Occasionally, we'll get a few black-bellied whistling ducks that spend the winter, but if you want to see black-bellies, you can start now and stay through July and August to see the peak of it. And also, we have a good number of wood ducks on the property, but they're a little more secretive. Public hunting opportunity is another large and probably our most visible objective of the property. It's not our leading objective though, but a lot of folks see it and think that is our only and leading objective of the property. We don't hunt the entire property, and the hunting we do allow is extremely limited. Our most open hunting is on Rhett's Island, which is only 3 days a week for half of the day. So nobody's shooting at roost birds. Every area has rest days. And then Butler Island's our most conservative hunting area. We hunt 1 day a week. It takes 7 years typically to get drawn for opening day to hunt it. It's an extremely desirable hunt. Folks travel from around the entire state to get out there to hunt it for 3 hours in the morning, and they love it. It gives a lot of public buy into the property. Folks travel for a long way. They spend money in hotel rooms. They spend money at restaurants. The local economy loves it. It's kind of a well-represented and well-accepted tradition in the Darien area. Green-winged teal, blue-winged teal, gadwall, ringnecks, those are kind of our bread and butter that time of year. But on opening day this year, I think we harvested 13 species of ducks. So we have a really great diversity of birds represented in those areas. And then also on the property, we have refuge habitats were established where there's no hunting at all, only resting and feeding for the birds. One of my favorite objectives of the property is to provide habitat for non-game and endangered wildlife. This objective has been there since the property was established, and it's kind of funny because it's hard to think of an endangered species that occupies the property now, because most of them that were endangered when the property was opened have been delisted. Wood stork, no longer listed as endangered. Bald eagle, no longer listed as endangered. Eastern indigo snake has been protected, but there's only a few on the property. Manatees occupy all the rivers and all the creeks around it. We have manatees all over the property, but not inside the impoundments, only on the outside. We don't have any red-cockaded woodpeckers in our area and on that lower upper section of Altamont, but we have lots of swallowtail kites that feed the impoundments all summer long. Alligators were originally on that endangered species list when the property was secured. Now they're a hunted species. We have probably the largest population of alligators on the Georgia coast occupying the property. It's great. Our alligators actually get to the point that they are a hindrance on our waterfowl recruitment. If you're a model duck or black-bellied whistling duck chick, you got a hard time swimming across one of those ponds this deep. So it's a pretty cool and rewarding thing. You got them managing for a suite of game birds. You see all these other species occupying and using the property and thriving. Fishing opportunities is something we provide kind of just anecdotally. We're right in the middle of the Altamont River. There's lots of fishing opportunities. And we also provide opportunities for habitat management demonstration areas. So we have some experimental tasks that we'll do occasionally that we try different methods on. We do lots of research on the property. Something we did a few years ago, which I thought was really enjoyable, was we had a PhD student from the University of Georgia that she kind of took advantage of all those cypress trees that we had just assumed all been dropped by the enslaved farmers and laid in the fields. So she was taking cross sections of these trees that have been laying out there, taking cookies out, taking them back to the lab in Athens and carbon dating these trees. Some of these trees have been laying on that field bed for 3,000 years. So they were not chopped over and laid over. They were typically, in that case, blown over by a hurricane, and they've still been laying there. Due to the conditions of the area, when it was a natural habitat, it was mostly under tide water or flood regimes, those cypress trees are preserved. The ones that are down in the mud, they're completely saturated year round unless we do an extreme dry island impoundment. It's hard to see from just this one table, but every one of these line graphs is an individual tree that we measured. And I don't have the axis down here, but some of these trees lived for 4,000 years before they died. Some of those older trees, like I said, have been laying in that field for 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years already. So think about when those trees actually germinated, when they sprouted, and how long those trees have been on that site. So that was one that, these trees are just, they're preserved by laying in that mud and laying on that site. They're not available for harvest, they're not available for public consumption. The public can't go out there and dig them up and take them to the sawmill. They're laying there and they're set in that landscape. And we've done some additional research since then on some more of the carbon dating and some of the other things. And the next thing we're going to do is look at oxygen isotopes in these trees and see how the growth effects have changed. And there's some tie-ins to how those trees were growing 3,000 and 4,000 years ago to how some of the trees are growing on the property now. But the take-home message from that now is that the bald cypress trees now are growing faster but living shorter lives. So they're growing acceleratedly to where they were a couple thousand years ago, but they're also shorter lifespan. And this is pre-colonization. So this is since the last ice age has changed things and everything's changed on the Georgia coast. We do quite a bit of waterfowl banding during the summer. We banned wood ducks and mottled ducks incidentally, but we banned quite a few black-belly whistling ducks. That's kind of our target species. For a little while there, I haven't checked it lately, but for a little while I was the lead bander of black-belly whistling ducks in the nation. I thought that was a pretty cool little claim. And I didn't know I was doing anything. I was just catching ducks and banding during the summer, but it's a pretty fun thing to do. We've got some really cool feedback on black-belly whistling ducks, on their patterns and their life ranges. There's one hen that I've caught 3 times. The last time I caught her, she was 9 years old. That's pretty cool. And she's been living right there on that property since the first year we banned her when she was a hatch-year chick. We did a pretty intensive study of modeling ducks a few years ago where we put satellite transmitters on a good number of model ducks, and lo and behold, all that data and all that data crunching and all the research, we pretty much found out that model ducks like using helmets on the Georgia coast and mud flats. It's kind of what we knew going into it. They like open water and open mud. We have a few different management techniques that we do to take care of this property. The first and foremost is straight up preservation. It's a secured property. It's no longer in limbo development. This is one of the trees on the left that I was telling you about. That's one of the virgin cypresses. This is not the biggest one. This is just one that you can get a clear view of it to visit with a few buddies a while back. There's a grove of probably 100 of those trees in the area that you can walk around and spend a midday walking around and seeing them. There's also a sign of the logging that cleared all the ones that are gone. There's still winches sitting out there. There's still cables running through the forest. There's still cables and blocking tackles tied up in some of these trees that are there that were used to drag the other trees out. The floral community in these areas is nearly 100% intact and native. Really the only landscape effect that's ever happened in this area was the logging of these trees, but all that logging was done with cross-cut saws, with axes, and with steam-powered winches and steam-powered barge equipment. After that was done, nobody wanted it. What was left was no longer economically viable. At that point, the state bought it. These areas are protected for perpetuity. So these freshwater floodplain forests, they're extremely beautiful, they're extremely unique. There's only a few of them up and down the coast from mid-Florida to the Virginias. If you haven't been out there in about mid-April, you really need to go. It's pretty amazing when everything starts budding out and blowing up. So preservation is a technique. A lot of people don't think about that as a management technique, but it's a very valid one. Getting more into our active management, conservation and maintenance. Within the impoundments, these are very modified systems. They do mimic natural systems, but they're modified systems. We do a lot of prescribed fire. We manage the water levels inside the impoundments. We raise them, lower them as we see fit to get the most bang for our buck for the vegetation community that we're targeting. We do a lot of monitoring. We fly for alligator nest survey every summer. We count every alligator nest on the property. That's been going on for 35 years. So monitoring is also a technique we use. And then continuous maintenance of the water control infrastructure on the property. So we have about 35 of these flat gate or rice trunk control systems on the property, and they take quite a bit of management to maintain. Occasionally we'll have a catastrophic failure on the property. The tide will come over in impoundment. We get a breach, and so when this occurs, we get some pretty extreme engineering involved. This metal wall is about 140 feet long. Those sheet piles are 60 feet long. So 45 feet of that metal is driven down into the earth to get down to some substrate that's solid enough to hold the upper part of place. So these are not our ideal management techniques, but these are what's required to fight against the tide. And I say we fight against the tide, but we never win that battle. So we do our best to work with it. We work with the ocean when we can, we work with the river when we can. But it requires some pretty extreme engineering and equipment to manage. You guys saw Sora and Rel and see any bitterns or not? It's too early still.
Didn't hear anything.
Didn't hear any bitterns.
We saw.
I would have only heard them.
We saw a few the week prior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some of those birds, like you're aware, they like these super thick cut grass thickets. Most of the birds we're targeting, they don't like those super, what we call cut grass infestations. Typically with water control and prescribed fire and a little bit of targeted herbicide application, we can control that cut grass and get these more diverse grass communities and forb communities that we're targeting. Occasionally we go in, we plow a field up. That's an example of using a ripper plow in a field after we burned it. So you look at this and you think, oh man, that's an extreme management technique. You're taking a farm tractor and you're making completely clean mud in essentially a wetland. If you want to see a flock of 100 Wilson snipe, go behind that tractor an hour later and look at it. The snipe will love it. The soars come in, they leave the thickets, and they come in there and start chasing insects and everything across it. It's pretty awesome seeing all this stuff going on when you do these manipulations. That's a quick and dirty overview of the Altamaha. That's kind of it. So I'm happy to take any questions. Talk about your other properties. If anybody wants to stick around after. Yes, sir.
I guess this is rumor control, but the rumor has it that the reason we aren't seeing so many doves near the dairy barn area is because you aren't putting a lot of water in there because of the hunters. Is that you're trying not to pull doves?
No, I can promise there's nothing to that.
That's what
The reason we don't put a lot of water in the dairy barn is, have you been to the dairy barn lately?
Our last week.
If you park there, if we put a lot of water in the dairy barn, that sand dike that's around that parking lot does not hold water back, and that parking lot and the dairy barn become 3 feet deep. So all of that infrastructure, the dairy barn, the creamery, all that stuff, when Houston had that property, for the most part, he didn't manage for waterfowl. He had some waterfowl properties that he managed on the back west side, but all that stuff by 17, it was managed for cattle and crops. So all that infrastructure that was built on the field bed, which is about 3 feet below the mean tide level. So if we let that flood to our max capacity, all that infrastructure will be underwater. So that's only the north section that you're talking about where we can't put much water in. The south section, if you're on the tower and looking south, there's a cross dike, and we can put a lot more water down there. There's 3 management units on that refuge side. There's the north refuge, which you're right, we don't get too deep typically because we do. People can't park, the dairy barn gets filled with water, city dairy gets upset. On the south side, you usually manage with quite a bit more water. There's a lot of birds, the deeper water birds use that side. And then the southeast side is a small little crescent. It's about a 30-acre unit. And that one, the water control structure's been rotted out and worn out for about 2 years. It's just one giant cut grass infestation right now. But we actually had a bid meeting last week to replace that water control structure, so that one's gonna be back in operation hopefully in the next 2-3 months. But the largest concentrations of birds I've seen on that property have been in the refuge. This photo is right there by the house pond. These trees are still standing there. They're on the little spit of vegetation that is across from the rice trunk. So if you're driving into Butler, and you're looking at that pond on the right, that's from that rock road. But once 10 trucks have come by, the birds are out of there for the day. They load it at night and use it early in the morning. And the cover photo that I have, or the wintering waterfowl photo, is that's in the East Refuge. So they love it when the time's right, but they also are very susceptible to disturbance, and there's a lot of activity in there. When you come by during peak overwintering, if you have a group of 8 or 10 people and anybody's making noise, those birds they're slipping out. But if it's a thick area and there's lots of sesbania and lots of cover, there'll be thousands of birds in there some evenings. It can be pretty amazing. We don't typically have those extreme concentrations. Usually it's 50 here, 100 there, 25 over here, but there have been some evenings where it's just a black wall of birds coming in there feeding during night, and then getting into quieter areas when they start getting disturbed.
I have a question about your alligators, because if one of the primary considerations or jobs is waterfowl maintenance for hunters, and if your alligator population is increasing, do you have issues with perhaps them decreasing population of waterfowl?
So the alligators don't have any effect on the wintering waterfowl.
No.
They're not
Okay.
feeding. Once we typically get our water levels set, my goal is Halloween. I want all my water right by Halloween. Typically by the end we've had a few cold spells. The water we're bringing in is usually cooler. Those alligators aren't feeding. They're sunning when they're out, but they're not feeding during that fluid part of the year. Right now the gators are out full force. Birds are starting to probably initiate nests, I would think right now. A few of the ducks, the wood ducks and the black bellies are starting to enter the boxes. I've seen some mottled ducks paired up, but they probably haven't started nest yet. They're about to start that. The issue during that rearing, getting a bird to fledge, is keeping the water shallow enough that the alligators they're breaking their back above the water line. They're not just fully submerged with their nose sticking out. If the water's this deep, those alligators they're toasting those chicks. They just go up behind them, and you can see when early in the morning you can see the dew on all the grass and everything. You'll see where the gators went behind. There's feathers scattered. If you can get the water anywhere in this shallow depth where it's deep enough for the hen to forge those chicks across those flats and get all the insects in that emergent vegetation and submerged vegetation, where they get plenty of insects, but keep it shallow enough those gators don't have free reign of everything, the birds love it. They concentrate in on it. And when we're banding, I can pretty much go out there in the day, ride the airboat around and find that water depth that I'm looking for, and go back that night and guarantee there's gonna be ducks in those areas just by finding that correct water depth where those hens wanna be and where those chicks are thriving at. Like I say, it's a water depth where the gators, they can get there no matter what, but they're having a belly crawl, they're having a make a ruckus, and the chicks are just sliding through it, feeding all night long. So you get some very tight details of where you want your water. We have 3,200 acres of impoundment there, so nothing is ever set to where everything is all the same. There's always a variety of habitat across that property. So we'll have some stuff that's set deep where alligators are nesting and producing young at. Most of the time the gator pods are on the edges of the canals and the ditches, and those younger and the 3 to 8 foot alligators are out there in the water in the middle, because they're also staying away from the big alligators, because the big alligators are eating them as well that time of year. So our wintering waterfowl, they're lucky. They come down after it's cold, the gators are just laying there. Now, we'll see gators 12 months a year. They're present all year out there. If we get a cold spell, they'll go down for a few days. We rarely get ice on those areas just because it's so much open water. But if we do get gators, just go to the ditches where it's deeper and put their tail in the deep end and porpoise their nose to the edge. Yes, ma'am.
So, I know you mentioned the mottled ducks. Has anyone ever done genetic testing to see if they're potentially hybridizing with mallards like they are in kind of a lot of like northern?
They do. Yeah, I can promise you that. We haven't done the genetics on it, but birds we've banded with mottled duck hens have been reported as mallards, and we've asked for photos. And they've had wing bars, they've had some of them turn into what looks like a mallard drake, and other ones have been reported looking like a nice pure Florida duck with no coloration on the wing other than like almost a black duck wing band on them, with no white on all. Our model ducks, my understanding was, are drift from Florida and Carolina. At some point, I've never seen it in documentation, but the second-hand, third-hand story I've been told is that at some point, one of the state agencies traded some turkeys to Texas or Louisiana, and model ducks came back in exchange. As you're probably very aware, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, these game managers and gamekeepers and the state agencies at that time, they were doing whatever they could to find a bird they could shoot, so birds were moved all over the place. I mean, I bet 90% of pheasant hunters think that bird is native to this continent. How did chachalakas get on Sapelo? They didn't fly there. But I like the models still, whether you want to call them a true native or not, they're still pretty cool duck.
Been on, I think, every property on that Omaha corridor map, other than Townsend. Is access to Townsend any different than any other WMA?
Nope, it's easy. Lots of
Fish
roads.
hunting license, that's all you need.
All of our properties are open 24/7, 365. Hunting license, fishing license. If you're set on not buying a hunting and fishing license, there's a lands pass just for the individuals that they say they don't want to contribute to hunting or fishing for ethical reasons. So they get a lands pass. It costs the exact same amount as a fishing license. But that's where our match funds come from. The way those Pitt and Robertson money are distributed is all that excise tax goes to the government, and then all the states go into this kind of calculator of acreage, the amount of public land, the amount of public citizens in the state, and a number of hunting and fishing licenses that they sell. And then that goes into a big equation of how much money goes back. And I think our last takes on that they're typically in the $26 million to $32 million ballpark. But that's all based on the number of citizens of the state of Georgia, hunting and fishing license sold, and the number of public in the state. So we're one of the larger withdrawers of Pitt and Robertson funds in the nation. Well, thanks for all coming out tonight.
I got one more for you.
Go for it.
I noticed the Ducks Unlimited logo on one of your slides. Is that?
They're a great partner.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
So-
What y'all do with them?
They had an event at Altama this weekend, right?
Yeah, so we had the Green Wing event out there on Saturday. I got a set of plans I brought, hoping somebody would ask about Ducks Unlimited. So, if anybody's ever done work with the state of Georgia, we sell everything to the high bidder, and we award everything to the low bidder. So if we need engineering or construction done, we award it to the low bidder in most circumstances, as long as they qualify for everything. This is an extremely specific habitat type with specific engineering. Ducks Unlimited has always been a supporter of the property since Ducks Unlimited started and since the DNR's in the business of waterfowl. But in the last probably 10 years, we've gotten a really amazing partnership with Ducks Unlimited. They have an engineering group that's in-house. The only thing that these folks work on is waterfowl habitats. The southeastern group works from Virginia all the way down through the panhandle of Florida. So they're working in this environment that we live in, that we're working in. They engineer water control structures, they engineer dikes, they know how to do the correct surveying for the bathymetry and the depths, and they know how to lay out the dikes where you actually have a drivable surface, then appropriate slopes, and then a borrow area to dig out of. So these are engineers that you're not gonna find in anybody else's firm or anywhere else. So we've been using their engineering capability, and they actually, they do all of our large scale construction projects now. So they survey the ground, they give us an engineering recommendation, they actually do the project execution, so they do the bid of their qualified operations of the contractors that are coming in and doing the work. They do all the weekly updates on the contract work, so they're looking at who's doing what, they're doing the weekly photos, the progress reports, they do the payouts every week or every month, whatever it is. And this is stuff that the state of Georgia engineers have absolutely no concept of. I asked one of our state of Georgia engineers to help me design a pond one time. He drew me a catfish pond, and I asked him how he was going to deal with the tide level. I was like, "What are you talking about? What do you mean tide?" The guy was in Athens, and he had no concept that the coast of Georgia had a tide level. Matt he didn't get a contract. But Ducks Unlimited, what they brought is some really extreme detailed partnership in their engineering, the project execution, and their fundraising, and their grant writing. So, we have two projects underway with them right now. One of them is this one on Butler Island. It's $375,000. It's replacing 3 water control structures and doing some additional surveying. That money is coming out of our waterfowl fund, which comes from waterfowl license sales. The other project they're doing right now is on Ceylon down in Camden County. It's a $650,000 project that we contributed $2,500 match to. Ducks Unlimited wrote the grant, they did the engineering, and they're providing every bit of the money through a NACA grant, North American Wetland Conservation Act. They're bringing that money to the site, and they're putting it on the ground as a conservation project. And that's not the first one. We've got NACA grants with them as either a co-applicant or them as an applicant nearly every year for the last 10 years.
What's
So
the
I
project
think-
at Ceylon?
So we're going into 7 different impoundments, either impoundments or ditch trained wetlands that have been artificially ditched. The ones that are natural wetlands that have been ditched for agriculture, for drainage, or for silviculture, we're plugging those ditches, we're filling the ditches up, we're restoring those areas to natural hydrology. There's a couple of areas on Ceylon that have been kind of modified waterfowl impoundments in the past. On those, we're going back in, we're changing the pipes out, we're putting new riser boxes in them. We're resetting the elevation so they can be waterfowl impoundments again. Those are all small impoundments. I think the smallest is like 3.5 acres. There's a natural cypress pond that Gopher Frogs use, but it's been ditched, so now we're replugging that. It's gonna regain the hydrology, so it'll be drier more years than it's wet now. Wood ducks use it. Blue-winged teal have been seen in it, green-winged teal have been in it, but it's gonna have a lot more effect on the other natural species there, not just waterfowl. And the biggest one, I think, is an 8-acre impoundment. That's kind of a low drain between 2 hills. It's got probably a 1920s berm across it, and we're changing out the pipe that goes under that, putting a riser box in it. So we'll have I think a 7.5 acre freshwater impoundment right on the edge of the Still River, which at that point is high saline. So that's gonna be a pretty hot spot for some birds. So yeah, Ducks Unlimited's been an amazing partner. They're pretty cool.
That's awesome. Well, thanks again, Robert.
Thank you.
Yeah. We started taking a full field trip, sorry things didn't work out scheduling, but, I'm always open for people visiting, whether it's Altamont or any of our other properties. We've got some pretty amazing natural areas and wildlife management areas.
Yeah. And this is the first of a series of 2 presentations from Georgia DNR speakers. So next month we'll have Brett Albanese, who leads the wildlife conservation section, so the other side of the house at Wildlife Resources Division. And so we'll get that perspective too. So come back out next month, and y'all have a good night.
I would say,